So this is a fun topic that is ties into a lot of things that people find interesting. Basically, how aquatic plants reproduce. And a nice example here, this is a close-up shot of some duckweeds, and they have a form of asexual reproduction where their floating body that we call a frond breaks off or buds out kind of a daughter frond from the existing frond. And so they're able to make another plant that's going to live independently, but it's made without, in this case, using seeds or flowers. So that's going to be kind of set us up for one of our distinctions we're going to make this time around. Okay, so when we talk about reproduction, we're just talking about reproducing. So the same as you would make in a photocopier, you take your starting paper and you make a copy of it. And biological reproduction, we're talking about copying the whole organism. So if you take that duckweed example, let's say these circles are duckweeds. One duckweed ends up becoming two duckweeds. And then they have potential to become two on their own and so on. This process is how species expand their ranges, how they disperse into new territory, and life in general, like the life of a species is kind of a battle between how much can you reproduce versus how much are your individuals dying. So making enough individuals to overcome ones that are lost by freezing or drying or herbivory or competition or all kinds of things that can challenge a species. If you are reproducing enough, you become more successful. And obviously we have the potential for some exponential increase here in the number of individuals you have. Sometimes we see this within a season. So in that duckweed example, you can start with one duckweed in a little corner of a pond, and by the end of the year with this exponential growth, you end up with a whole pond covered in duckweed. So when people talk about reproduction, we often talk about sexual reproduction. And in plants, this is maybe a more important distinction to make. So what I just talked about with the duckweeds is a form of asexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction involves sperm and egg in plants, the same as it does in animals. We use these same terms, actually, sperm and egg. It's a little trickier, and I'm not going to go into the details, but technically within the pollen grains are cells we consider to be sperm cells or sperm nuclei anyway. So that's kind of the male component in the stamens of a flower, and the female component are these ovules. And inside of an ovule is an egg. So ultimately, we still have sperm going to egg through the process of fertilization, and that is sexual reproduction. And in the flowering plants, that involves flowers. So when we don't clarify, if you just talk about reproductive functions in plants, people are often talking about flowers and this kind of reproduction. But just kind of keep in mind that when we say reproduction, there's also this other term, vegetative reproduction or asexual reproduction, that is also possible for a whole bunch of plants. All right, so male function, female function. Seeing them in a flower, you can see diagrams like this that are longitudinal sections. The way that flowers are put together, again, we're not going to go into that in detail, but hopefully maybe you've learned about it in another class. Toward the center in almost all flowers that have them are the female structures. So the center here is a pistil with a larger part that contains the ovules, some transmitting tissue where the pollen grain actually lands on this stigma zone up here and grows through the style toward an ovule. So that's sort of the female function, and it's a separate organ of the flower, the pistil. Then outside of that, so just outside of that are these stamens. So whole thing is a stamen, and toward the top is the anther, which is basically the pack where the pollen grains are produced and distributed from. As I'll show you, a lot of plants have both of these in the same flower, but not always is that the case. And then just a photograph to kind of clarify that. This is a flower of plant Alisma. And you can see the male parts, these 1, 2, 3, 4 easily visible stamens, and then 2 other stamens. There's a nice symmetry to that. evenly spaced around a circle. So 6 stamens placed around. And then the center here, a little bit harder to make out. This plant actually has a lot of separate pistils or carpels, and those are connected to each of these separate white strands that are going to help the pollen get there. So female function at the center, male function just outside of that, and then often, but not always, petals of some kind, sepals, the green leafy stuff toward the very outside of a flower. Those help with attraction and sometimes protection, as we will see. So these plants, if they have male and female parts in the same flower, they can self-fertilize. That's within the same flower. So it's possible that the pollen from one of these anthers ends up on the stigma of the same flower. If that happens and results in fertilization, where the sperm cell makes it to the egg cell, then we call that self-fertilization. That seems pretty intuitive. There's another term I'm going to introduce here. We'll probably come back to it in a later lecture. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's called geitonogamy. And geitonogamy is the function where you're fertilizing a flower on the same plant with your own pollen. So genetically, it's kind of worth mentioning that genetically, that's about the same thing as self-fertilization within the same flower. If you are the same genetic individual and you are contributing your sperm cells to fertilize your egg cells, then you have fertilized yourself. And this term geitonogamy refers to fertilization within the same plant, except using different flowers on that plant. Okay, so these are forms of sexual reproduction. As we talk about the genetics of this, they don't necessarily help you with genetic variability, maybe a little bit, but it's still a nice option for some plants if they have challenge getting somebody else's pollen, and using your own is not so bad. Home bought is no, store bought is okay. Homegrown is okay too. So just showing you some variation in how flowers are put together. If you're getting into botany and you're studying all of these and you're learning the details of how to recognize every sort of plant that's out there, you get very familiar with the variation in how flowers are put together. But there are a few rules, as I mentioned. So female structures toward the middle. In a couple cases here, we've got in the middle 2 styles coming out from that central female structure, crowned with 2 stigmas there. This one on the left, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 separate carpels, separate female structures on this pondweed. And then this one on the right, you can just see the stigma of that one. But kind of knowing by position, you would know that is the female structure at the center. Around the outside, in this case, we've got 6 stamens around the outside. Here we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looks like stamens. In this one, often they have this kind of grainy appearance at the anthers where the pollen has been released, but it's still stuck to the anther on the outside. In this case, we have some that haven't even opened yet. So these are anthers that haven't opened, but still arranged outside of the carpels on those plants. A lot of people don't end up needing these for identifying species, but again, like I say, if you spend a lot of time and you get familiar with plants in their more botanical terminology, you'll get familiar with the variation among flowers. All of these are pretty small as well, so I think that's part of the process, is getting familiar with looking at small things. Okay, so we saw some examples of flowers that are bisexual, both male and female function in the same flower. And now we've got some examples where you can have flowers that have only male parts or only female parts. There's a lot of variation in species and how these are put together. There are advantages and disadvantages. Also something that's really cool to talk about, but beyond what we're going to cover right now anyway. Just want to show you some of the differences among these. So female flowers and male flowers of this water milfoil. Female flowers, the feathery stuff is stigma. That's a texture that we often see on stigmas for catching pollen. Big surface area, allowing those pollen grains to stick where they need to stick. The flowers that are just male have a big investment in pollen production, so often you see bigger anthers So these are anthers that are distributing pollen. They look kind of dangly. We often see that in plants that have their pollen carried by the wind. And another example on the right, revisiting a lot of the same things I just talked about, except in this case, these globes are multiple flowers at a time. So globe of female flowers toward the bottom and globes of male flowers toward the top. And then finally on the right here, we've got a female flower next to a male flower produced by the same plant, and you can see pretty stark difference there. This green bit here is a whole bunch, unusually large number of these female units, the carpels. Lots of them are present in plants of this Sagittaria genus. And then over here, this yellow color is often a color of stamens, I should say anthers. Yellow pollen is very common, and so sometimes that's something to watch out for. So if you don't have female structures, then your male structures are the most central thing. And then here we have the female structures still the center, but not surrounded then by male structures toward the outside. All right, so the subject of flowers gets us into the subject of pollination. How does the pollen get from one flower to another? We already talked about how pollen can end up fertilizing the flower that it's already, the female part of the same flower that it came from. That would not be the most effective way to do fertilization. And certainly it would not justify the elaborate structures we see in flowers. So flowers are very diverse in colors and shapes and sizes and scents and rewards, all kinds of things. And a lot of times, at least many of these that we think about, they are specialized to attract a certain kind of animal that has the job of transferring the pollen. So these flowers are attractive to animals. The animals get a reward, often nectar, sometimes pollen. The animals visit the flowers, and often haphazardly. They're not necessarily trying to get covered in pollen. Usually it's a side effect that benefits the flower. So while they're visiting for their reward, they get some pollen on their bodies, and then they move that to the next flower that they then also are going to expect a reward from. So plants that have showy flowers, this often goes along with animal attraction, quite often insects, but not always. Just some examples here of the diversity of insects you might find visiting flowers and the diversity of flowers you might have. There's also the possibility that your pollen is getting moved around abiotically. So abiotic is without an animal to carry the pollen. Big trade-off here, where animals that carry pollen are pretty efficient about it. So if you get your pollen on a bee, it's going to go directly to another flower in a lot of cases. And so you have basically given your pollen to a messenger, and that messenger is going where you need it to go. If you are putting your pollen in the wind, so these are pollen grains that blow around on a pretty small scale, microscopic. This is the reason people get pollen allergies, is there's tons of pollen in the air as these various pollen grains are trying to find their targets. We see some of the patterns here for wind pollinated flowers where, again, they're pretty reduced. So we don't see bright colors. We don't see big petals. If you smelled these, you wouldn't have an aroma, an attractive smell to them. They're not offering a nectar reward. And instead they produce, so they kind of take the energy that they shared and they turn that into a lot of pollen production. So you've got to put out way more pollen if your individual pollen grains aren't getting carried somewhere. So lots of pollen production. Again, these big anthers here on this grass, and then larger feathery stigmas to catch the pollen that, again, nobody's delivering it. You got to sort of catch it out of the air. So big feathery stigmas on this grass, big feathery stigmas on our water milfoil, and rather large feathery stigmas on this pondweed here. There's another term called inflorescence that refers to how the flowers are put together. I won't go into detail, but just kind of mention how this, if you're keying out a plant and you're encountering these words about how to identify it, there's a whole bunch of terminology referring to how the flowers are put together. Do they have a flat top? Are they coming from one position, as in this milkweed? Are they flowers produced at different positions along a stem? Do the flowers have stalks or not? So on and so on. Okay, so I think I kind of mentioned this before, but here's some close-ups describing the process. Um, Pollination is the sort of the first part of the process. Pollination specifically refers to putting the pollen from the source, so basically from the source flower, from the source anther, getting that onto the stigma of the destination flower is the process of pollination. So moving pollen is pollination. And the later step of actually getting that pollen grain to meet up with the ovule, that's the process of fertilization. So close-ups here, the pollen, this example on the right, pollen is sort of stuck on that stigma. And then lower down, these are the pollen tubes. So the pollen grains actually have a cellular tube that grows out of them and grows down through the style toward an ovule.